All right, get ready, because today we're going deep on dependent origination.
Oh, yeah.
It's huge GE in Buddhist thought, right?
It is. It's everywhere. Like
Yeah.
foundational.
And not just some obscure thing either. We're going to see how it applies to, well, everything, really.
Pretty much.
So we're working with some really cool material for this deep dive.
Yeah, definitely.
We've got writings on, the fundamentals of Buddhist thought.
Course stuff.
And we've even got the Wikipedia article on Pratītyasamutpāda. Always a good sign we're getting serious, right?
Got to go to the source, right?
Exactly. And Pratītyasamutpāda, for anyone who doesn't speak Sanskrit, basically means dependent origination, just in case you were wondering.
Always good to clarify.
Right. So I've heard dependent origination described as like a guide to understanding the mind. What's your take on that?
I mean, it can be, definitely. It's suggesting this deep interconnectedness, right? Like everything is linked.
Okay, so instead of things just happening randomly, there's always this chain of causes and conditions.
Exactly. Nothing just pops up out of nowhere. Everything arises in dependence on other things.
Whoa. Okay, I'm already feeling my brain bending a little.
It's a mind bender for sure.
So hang on, no first cause then? No Big Bang moment in this worldview?
Nope. Dependent origination shifts the focus. Instead of looking for a beginning or an end, it's about understanding this web of conditions, this constant flow of cause and effect,
Okay, I'm with you so far, but how does this play out, practically in our lives? I'm seeing this big connection to suffering in the materials we've got.
Yeah, you hit a major point there. Suffering is obviously central to Buddhist thought.
Understatement of the century.
And dependent origination gives us this framework for understanding how suffering happens, where it comes from.
Okay, so it's not that we're just destined to suffer. It's more like suffering happens because of specific causes. Kind of like if you plant tomato seeds, you're not going to get cucumbers.
Right. That's actually a great analogy.
Right. So there are conditions for things to arise. And dependent origination explores the conditions that lead to suffering. It's all very cause and effect.
It is. And the Buddha laid out these conditions, these links in the chain, so to speak, and they're called the 12 nidanas.
Yeah, the 12 nidanas, I'm seeing them often depicted as a wheel or sometimes a chain in the Buddhist texts we've been reading.
Right. They can be a lot to unpack. We definitely won't get into every detail today.
Agreed. Let's save everyone's brains for future episodes.
But just to give a sense of the big picture, the traditional way of interpreting these nidanas is as a description of rebirth.
Okay, rebirth. So we're already in pretty deep territory here.
We are, but it's important stuff. So for someone who's maybe new to this, can we just clarify what we mean by rebirth in Buddhism?
Yeah, let's do that, because it's not always intuitive.
Right, and it's easily misunderstood. This isn't about a soul in the way we might typically think of it, like a static me being reborn over and over.
Right, it's not like reincarnation in that sense.
Exactly. It's more about the continuation of karmic energy. Like our actions, our thoughts, our intentions, they all create these ripples that influence future experiences, future arising.
It's more like a flow of cause and effect across lifetimes, not a literal, you coming back with all your memories and stuff.
You got it. Think of a wave in the ocean. It's a distinct wave for a while. You can see it. It has a shape.
Right. You can point to it and be like, that's the wave.
But it's also part of this much bigger continuous process. It's not really separate from the ocean itself.
That's a helpful way to visualize it for sure. But what's interesting? I'm also seeing that some scholars interpret the 12 nidanas differently.
Oh, yeah. How so?
They're saying it's not just about rebirth, but about what's happening in our minds right now, in this very moment.
Oh, interesting. So while that traditional view focuses on rebirth, this other interpretation is saying the 12 nidanas describe how suffering pops up in our present moment experience, too.
Exactly. It's like, have you ever noticed how one thought can spiral? It sets off this chain reaction of thoughts and emotions.
All the time, especially these days with everything going on.
That's dependent origination in action. One little thing happens and boom, chain reaction.
Exactly. It shows how these seemingly small events trigger all these mental events, and that can lead to frustration, stress, even suffering.
So even if you're not thinking about past lives or future lives, this present moment interpretation still feels super relevant, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely, because we're always in the present moment, right? So understanding how suffering or even just dissatisfaction arises in our immediate experience, that's huge.
It's like, okay, I can wrap my head around that. I can see how this applies to my life right now.
That's what's so cool about dependent origination. It works on multiple levels.
All right, so we're talking about mental processes, and some of those links in the 12 nidanas really stand out to me. Stuff like ignorance, mental formations, consciousness, feeling.
Yeah, those are big ones. And notice how they're all connected, just like we've been saying. It's not random, it's a process.
So let's break down a few of these, starting with ignorance. Now, this isn't about being stupid or uneducated.
Yeah.
It's something deeper. Yeah.
Way deeper. It's more like a fundamental disconnect from the true nature of reality, a misperception of how things actually are.
Okay, so it's not that we're not smart enough to get it, but that we're operating from this, like, flawed perception of reality. Would you say that's a good way to put it?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And this ignorance, this misperception, it influences how we act, how we experience the world, and that brings us to the next link, mental formations.
Mental formations, right? Tricky word.
Yeah.
But basically our thoughts, intentions, actions, that kind of thing.
Exactly. They're conditioned by ignorance, meaning they come from that place of not quite seeing reality clearly.
So we're acting based on this kind of skewed understanding of how things work.
And that's going to lead to, well, more of the stuff we're trying to avoid: suffering, confusion.
Oh man, it's like a vicious cycle. We create the very problems we're trying to get away from.
Deep, right. And from these mental formations, then arises consciousness. Vijnana, if we're being fancy.
Right. Gotta love the Sanskrit.
So this consciousness, it's our moment-to-moment experience, what we're aware of through our senses, what we see, hear, think, all that.
But, and this feels important, this consciousness isn't neutral, right? It's shaped by everything that came before it.
Exactly. It's colored by our mental formations, which themselves came from ignorance. It's all connected, you see.
So the way we experience the world, how we perceive things, it's not objective.
Not in the slightest. Our perception is shaped by all these underlying conditions.
Wow, okay. And then naturally, from consciousness comes feeling.
Vedana, to use the Buddhist term, it's our emotional response to what we experience.
So whether I feel happy about something, sad, angry, whatever, that's directly tied to how I'm perceiving it, which you just said is shaped by all these other factors, mental formations, ignorance. It's like a domino effect.
It is. And it keeps going. From feelings, then we get craving.
Craving. Now we're talking. This one I get. Taka in Tali.
Oh,
Right?
you know your stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, and craving is basically our very human tendency to want the pleasant stuff and push away the unpleasant stuff.
Like, duh. Who wants to feel bad? We cling to the things that feel good, right?
And that clinging is the next link in the chain, upadana in Pali. We get attached, we grasp.
It's like craving is the glue that keeps this whole cycle stuck together.
Powerful image. And it's true, we crave, we grasp, and then we suffer when things change, because change is inevitable.
And things always change. It's one of the few guarantees in life.
And that, you see, is what the Buddha was trying to show us. Suffering isn't some random punishment. It's the natural consequence of this chain of causes, these 12 links.
This is blowing my mind. So you're saying if we can see these patterns, how our minds actually create suffering, maybe we can do something about it.
Now you're getting it. It's not just about diagnosing the problem. It's about realizing, hey, there's a way out. There's a path to liberation.
Okay, now that's what I'm here for. But before we get to that, there's something I'm still a little fuzzy on. We've got these 12 nidanas, this chain reaction, but when does it happen?
Good question. See, there's some debate about the timing of these 12 links. Like, does this whole process happen across multiple lifetimes, with rebirth, or is it happening in a single moment?
Wait, what? Which is it? That's a pretty big difference.
Right. I know, it's a bit of a head scratcher. And honestly, there are different interpretations out there.
So are we talking lifetimes or like a single thought? Help me out here.
Well, some scholars, really smart folks actually, they argue that the whole shebang, all 12 links, can happen in a single moment of consciousness.
No way. Like that fast.
That fast, which I think kind of shows how deep this whole thing is, right? It's not just about fitting it into a timeline.
So it's not either or, it's both. It's happening over lifetimes, A and D, in this very moment simultaneously.
Exactly. It's about understanding that the principles apply on multiple levels.
Okay, that actually makes a lot of sense. This framework, it works for these huge cosmic timescales, but it also applies to the smallest, most fleeting moments of our lives.
Exactly. And honestly, I think that's pretty cool. It gives it a depth,
Totally. It's not limiting, it opens things up. And I guess ultimately it's up to each of us to figure out what resonates.
Exactly. Explore the different interpretations, see what clicks for you.
I like that. No dogma, just exploration. That's what this deep dive is all about, right?
100%. And speaking of exploring, there's this other fascinating aspect we haven't even touched on yet. It's about the historical context. where these ideas came from.
Oh, yeah. Let's go there. I love the historical stuff.
So our research mentions these potential connections between dependent origination and ancient Vedic traditions, like the stuff that was around in India before Buddhism even existed.
Whoa. So the Buddha might have been drawing on, like, even older ideas.
It's possible. Some scholars suggest he was taking familiar concepts and kind of, well, flipping them on their head.
I love that. Subverting expectations, right? So what kinds of ideas are we talking about?
Well, in some Vedic creation myths, the universe comes from a primordial sacrifice, like this big cosmic event.
Right, a starting point.
Exactly. And some scholars think the Buddha might have been pushing back against that idea.
So instead of a top-down creation story, he's saying, nope, it's all interconnected, no first cause, just this web of conditions.
Right. A radical departure from the traditional narratives.
So cool. We're getting this glimpse into the world the Buddha was living in, the ideas he was responding to.
And by understanding that context, I think it gives us a whole new appreciation for how radical, how revolutionary his teachings really were.
I'm with you there. Okay, but before we go full history nerd,
Always a risk with us.
we've explored the what and the how of dependent origination, but I think the biggest question is, okay, so what? How does knowing all this actually help us live better lives?
The million-dollar question, right? The so what? That's where we need to go next.
Right, got to bring it back to, like, what's the point of all this, right?
Totally. So we're getting practical. We're talking about how understanding dependent origination, these 12 links, how that can actually, help us in our everyday lives.
Because, honestly, sometimes I feel like this stuff can just stay theoretical,
I hear that, but dependent origination, it's got real practical applications, I think. Like, one of the most immediate ones is self-awareness.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
So by understanding that our experiences are all, coming from this chain of causes and conditions,
We're not just, random victims of our own minds.
we can start to see the patterns.
Exactly.
I like that. So instead of being like, ugh, why do I always feel this way? What's wrong with me?
Which, let's be real, we've all been there.
It's like the human condition. Right. But with dependent origination, it's more like, okay, hold on. What led up to this feeling? What were the triggers?
Right. You're not just blaming yourself, you're getting curious about the
Yeah.
process.
Like, oh, that stressful meeting always triggers my anxiety, which then makes me want to devour an entire pizza.
There it is. That's dependent origination in action right there.
Right. So then the question becomes, okay, what can I do differently? Maybe instead of inhaling a pizza, I take a walk, do some breathing exercises.
Exactly. You're not just reacting habitually, you're making a conscious choice.
It's like we're taking back control. I love that.
And from that place of awareness, then we can start to cultivate self-compassion too.
Oh, right. Because we're not just beating ourselves up for being flawed or whatever.
We're like, okay, these patterns, these reactions, they come from somewhere. It's not about letting myself off the hook, but it's about being understanding.
Yeah, it's like that saying, pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional.
Ooh, I like that.
Right. Maybe by understanding where the suffering is coming from, we can, loosen his grip on us a little bit.
Absolutely. And it doesn't start with ourselves either.
Oh, right. Because if we're all interconnected,
Which, hello, dependent origination.
then that compassion, it naturally extends to other people too, right?
Exactly. If I can see how my own actions are conditioned by, a million things I'm not always aware of.
Then it's easier to have compassion for other people even when they mess up.
Because you realize, hey, they're operating from their own set of conditions, their own karma.
It's not about condoning bad behavior,
Right, not at all.
but it's about approaching situations with more, understanding, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. You can still hold boundaries. You can still disagree.
But you're not coming from that place of judgment. Okay, I'm really digging this. This is making dependent origination feel way less theoretical and way more, applicable to my life.
Right. It's not just a philosophy. It's a way of being in the world.
So we've talked about suffering, but clearly dependent origination isn't just about dwelling on the negative, right? There's also this whole piece about liberation, about finding freedom from those cycles of suffering.
That's really the heart of the Buddhist path.
Okay, so how do we get there? How does understanding dependent origination actually help us to, suffer less?
So the idea is by really getting this principle deep down, internalizing it, we start to see through the illusions that keep us trapped in suffering.
Illusions, huh? Like what? Give me an example.
Well, one of the biggest illusions is this idea of a separate self.
Oh, right, like the me that's separate from everything else.
Yeah. Yeah, that we're like these isolated islands.
Which, now that we're talking about interconnectedness, that seems kind of silly, right?
Exactly. Dependent origination shows us that this separate self is an illusion.
Because everything's connected, everything arises depending on other things. So, like, who is this me that's independent?
Right. And as we start to see through that illusion, our sense of self, it starts to
Oh, it
change.
softens, it expands.
Exactly. We start to feel more connected, not just to other people, but to everything.
To the whole universe.
Exactly. And that shift in perspective, that's where the liberation comes in.
Because we're not so caught up in our own little dramas anymore.
We can let go of that burden of trying to maintain this separate self that doesn't actually exist.
This is blowing my mind. So it's not about erasing the self, it's about seeing it differently.
Right. Recognizing its interconnected nature, its impermanent nature.
And when we can really grasp that, that's when we start to experience more freedom, more peace.
That's the idea. And that's why this stuff is so powerful.
It's not just some intellectual exercise.
It's about transforming the way we experience ourselves and the world around us.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about how dependent origination plays out in our own lives, our minds.
Relationships,
Right, all that. But I'm wondering, does this principle apply on a bigger scale too? Like to society as a whole?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, it's crucial to look at it that way, I think.
So we're not just talking about individual karma, but like a collective karma too. The choices we make as a society, having consequences, shaping the world.
Exactly. Think about the big issues we face. Social injustice, political polarization, all that. Those aren't just random things that happen.
They're coming from somewhere.
They're arising from conditions, just like everything else. Historical factors, systemic structures, individual choices. It's all connected.
Okay, that's kind of heavy, but I get it. So if we look at these huge societal problems through the lens of dependent origination,
We can start to see them not as inevitable, but as arising from specific causes.
and if we understand the causes, maybe we can actually do something about them.
That's the hope, right? It's not about throwing our hands up and saying, well, that's just the way it is.
Right, but honestly, it feels a bit daunting. These are big problems. How can understanding this one principle, dependent origination, actually make a difference on that scale?
I hear you. It's easy to feel powerless. But I think dependent origination gives us a few key things to work with. First, it reminds us that even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Okay, like the butterfly effect, chaos theory and all that.
Kind of, but more about intentionality. Like, if you drop a pebble in a pond, it creates ripples, right? They might seem small, but they go outward.
So it's not about feeling like we have to solve everything ourselves, but that our actions, even small ones, they matter.
Exactly. And that leads to the second thing, collective action. Dependent origination shows us that we're not isolated, we're interconnected, which means we can accomplish way more together than we ever could alone.
So we're not off the hook. It's about joining forces, pooling our resources, all of that.
Exactly. Leveraging our collective wisdom, our compassion to create real change. And that brings us to another aspect of dependent origination we haven't talked about much yet, the natural world.
Oh, right. We've talked about ourselves, our minds, even society.
Yeah.
But we haven't talked about the environment. How does dependent origination apply to, like, trees and oceans and stuff?
It's all connected. Just like our thoughts and feelings are linked, so too are all living beings and the ecosystems we're a part of. The natural world is like peak dependent origination in action, wouldn't you say?
Okay, yeah, I can see that. Everything depending on everything else for survival, for balance.
And when we mess with that balance through things like, pollution, deforestation, we're not just harming the environment as if it's something separate from us.
Or harming ourselves.
Exactly. And that realization can be a powerful motivator for change. It's not about saving the planet as if it's some separate entity.
It's about recognizing that our own well-being is completely bound up with the well-being of the entire web of life.
Right. We talk about environmental issues, but dependent origination shows us, hey, these are our issues. We're all stakeholders here.
And that actually brings us back to something you said earlier, environmental karma. What did you mean by that?
It's a way of understanding that our actions have consequences, not just in this lifetime, but across generations. Our choices today about how we consume, how we treat the natural world, those ripples outward.
Like a collective responsibility for the future.
Exactly. And that can feel heavy, but it's also empowering because we have the ability to make different choices, to shift the course of things.
So dependent origination, it's not a recipe for despair.
Yeah, not at all. It's a call to action. It's about waking up to the reality of interconnectedness and recognizing the power we have to create a more positive, more sustainable future.
This has been incredible. Seriously, mind-blowing. We've explored so many aspects of dependent origination, from rebirth to mental processes to society to the environment.
Even environmental karma.
It's a lot to take in. But for someone who's maybe new to all this, what would you say is the key takeaway? If they only remember one thing from this deep dive, what should it be?
That's a good question. I'd say remember this. Everything is connected. Your actions, your thoughts, they all have consequences. Not just for you, but for the whole web of life. And by understanding that interconnectedness, you can start to live with more awareness, more compassion, more responsibility.
That's a beautiful way to put it. And on that note, we're going to have to wrap up this deep dive. But remember, this is just the beginning of the journey, right? There's always more to explore with dependent origination.
Oh, yeah, this is a lifelong practice. The more you understand it, the more you see it everywhere. It changes how you see the world.
So as you go about your day, keep those 12 links in mind. Remember, you're not separate. You're part of something much larger than yourself. And within that web of interconnection, you have the power to make choices that create a more positive, beneficial future. Thanks for joining us.